There's a specific kind of exhaustion that arrives for empaths somewhere past 50. Not the ordinary tiredness of getting older, but something else entirely, something almost nobody prepares you for, because most conversations about empaths are written by and for people decades younger, still in the thick of building careers, raising children, figuring out early relationships. Today we're talking about 7 signs that matter specifically at this stage of life, signs that, if ignored, tend to compound into something far more serious than simple fatigue, and that, if actually heeded, can open up one of the richest, most settled chapters an empath ever gets to experience. Let's start with something important to establish before we go through the signs themselves. An empath who's lived 50 or more years has usually spent decades absorbing other people's emotional weight, often without ever having language for what that absorption was actually costing them. This means the signs we're covering today aren't early warning signs in the way they might be for a younger person just discovering their sensitivity. They're often late-stage signals, arriving after decades of accumulated depletion, which means ignoring them carries a different kind of risk than ignoring similar signs earlier in life. The body and mind, at this stage, have less reserve capacity to simply push through and recover the way they may have in younger years. The first sign, a sudden, marked drop in tolerance for environments you used to navigate without difficulty. Crowded family gatherings, noisy restaurants, long social obligations that never used to bother you nearly this much. This shift often gets misread, both by the person experiencing it and by people around them, as simple crankiness or age-related rigidity. But for an empath specifically, this drop in tolerance usually reflects something more precise. Decades of absorbing environmental and emotional stimulation have gradually reduced the buffer that used to make these situations manageable, and what once required moderate effort now genuinely depletes something that takes much longer to recover. Ignoring this sign, pushing through it the way you always have, tends to produce increasingly severe payback afterward. Not just tiredness, but a kind of prolonged emotional and physical flatness that can last days rather than hours. The second sign, a growing, sometimes unsettling awareness of exactly how much of your life has been organized around other people's needs, arriving with a specific kind of grief that's different from ordinary reflection. This often surfaces around milestone ages, or after children become independent, or after retirement removes the structure that used to justify constant caregiving and accommodation. The grief here isn't really about regretting the caregiving itself. For most empaths, that caregiving was genuine and meaningful. It's about recognizing, often for the first time with real clarity, how little of that same energy was ever redirected toward their own unmet needs, and how much time has now passed while that pattern went unexamined. Ignoring this sign, dismissing it as simply midlife reflection with nothing actionable attached, tends to let the pattern continue uninterrupted into the years that remain, which carry less time to reverse course than the decades already spent. The third sign, physical symptoms that don't have a clear medical explanation, but that correlate suspiciously closely with specific people or situations. Headaches that appear reliably after certain phone calls, digestive issues that flare during particular family visits, chronic tension that eases noticeably during time away from certain relationships. This is worth taking seriously specifically at this stage of life, because decades of unaddressed emotional absorption tend to eventually manifest somatically. And a body that's been quietly carrying this weight for 50-plus years often has less resilience left to keep converting emotional strain into invisible internal cost without any physical signal at all. Ignoring this sign, treating it purely as a medical mystery disconnected from relational patterns, means missing an important piece of the actual picture, one that often responds far more effectively to addressing the underlying relational strain than to any purely physical intervention alone. The fourth sign, a growing intolerance for relationships that require constant management, translation, or emotional labor just to remain functional, paired with a corresponding, sometimes surprising pull toward relationships that are genuinely easy. This shift often gets misread as becoming harder to please, or less patient in later life, when it actually reflects something healthier. An accumulated, hard-won recognition of exactly how much energy certain relationships have always required, now finally registering as unsustainable rather than simply normal. Ignoring this sign, continuing to invest heavily in relationships that have always demanded disproportionate management, means spending increasingly limited time and energy on exactly the dynamics least likely to provide anything back in return during years that are, realistically, more limited than the decades already behind you. The fifth sign, a persistent, sometimes disorienting difficulty distinguishing your own genuine preferences from decades of accommodating everyone else's, showing up as real uncertainty when asked simple questions. What do you actually want to do this weekend? Where do you actually want to go? What do you actually enjoy, independent of what would please whoever's asking? This confusion, while uncomfortable, is actually a sign worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple indecisiveness, because it reveals just how thoroughly decades of empathic accommodation have blurred the line between genuine preference and reflexive people-pleasing. Ignoring this sign means continuing to live largely according to other people's preferences by default, simply because your own have become genuinely difficult to locate without deliberate, patient effort to rediscover them. The sixth sign, an increasing, sometimes urgent need for solitude that feels different in quality than earlier in life, less about recovering from a specific stressful event, and more about a baseline requirement that's simply grown over the decades. This often gets misinterpreted by both the empath and the people around them as withdrawal, depression, or disengagement from life. But for many empaths at this stage, this shift actually reflects something healthier and more accurate. After 50-plus years of absorbing other people's emotional realities, the nervous system genuinely requires more unstructured, unstimulated time in order to process and recover than it once did. And ignoring this need, continuing to fill every available hour with social obligation the way earlier decades demanded, tends to produce a kind of chronic, low-grade depletion that never gets the chance to actually resolve. The seventh sign, and one that ties everything else together, a quiet but persistent sense that time now feels different, more finite, more precious, less available for continuing to spend on patterns and relationships that have never actually served you well. This sign is worth taking with particular seriousness because it's usually accurate. The specific quality of urgency that arrives somewhere past 50 isn't anxiety or panic. It's an honest, calibrated recognition that the decades ahead genuinely are fewer than the decades already spent, and that continuing indefinitely to defer your own needs, your own preferences, your own recovery, in favor of patterns established decades earlier, carries a cost that compounds differently now than it did when there seemed to be limitless time ahead to eventually address it. I want to say something important about why these 7 signs matter specifically at this stage of life, rather than simply being generic empath advice that applies at any age. Younger empaths, even when depleted, generally have more physical and psychological reserve to recover from ignoring these signs temporarily, more time ahead to eventually course correct, and often less accumulated evidence about which specific patterns and relationships have consistently cost more than they've given. An empath over 50 has decades of actual data available. Real patterns, real relationships, real evidence about what depletes and what restores. And ignoring the 7 signs at this stage means ignoring not a vague theoretical possibility, but a mountain of specific, accumulated personal evidence about exactly what needs to change. I want to be honest about something before we move into the second half of this conversation. None of this is about becoming cold, withdrawn, or suddenly abandoning people who genuinely matter to you. It's about applying decades of hard-won self-knowledge toward the years that remain, rather than continuing to operate on default settings that were established, often unconsciously, decades earlier under very different circumstances, with far less clarity about what actually needed protecting. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. what it actually looks like to respond to these 7 signs at this specific stage of life, why the work required now is often faster and more direct than it would have been decades earlier, and why this particular chapter, approached well, has the potential to become the most genuinely peaceful one an empath ever gets to experience. Let's talk about what it actually looks like to respond to these 7 signs at this specific stage of life, because the good news, and it's genuinely good news, is that the work required now tends to move faster and more directly than it would have decades earlier, precisely because of everything accumulated in the meantime. Here's the first thing worth understanding about responding well at this stage. You no longer need extensive trial and error to figure out what actually depletes you versus what actually restores you. A 25-year-old empath often has to experiment, sometimes for years, to distinguish which relationships and environments genuinely cost more than they give. An empath past 50 usually already knows this, with real clarity, built from decades of direct evidence. This means the actual work at this stage isn't primarily about discovery, it's about permission. Permission to finally act on data you've already had for a very long time, rather than continuing to override it out of old habit or old obligation. Let's walk through what this actually looks like, sign by sign, because concrete practice matters more than abstract encouragement at this point. For the first sign, reduced tolerance for demanding environments, the actual work is remarkably simple in concept, even if it requires real courage and practice. Start declining, selectively and without extensive justification, the specific environments you already know deplete you disproportionately. This doesn't mean withdrawing from life entirely. It means finally trusting the decades of evidence you already have about which specific gatherings, which specific durations, which specific settings consistently cost more than they're worth, and beginning to say no to those specific things without needing to build an elaborate case for why. For the second sign, grief about a life organized around others' needs, the actual work involves something more internal, allowing the grief to be felt fully, rather than immediately rushing past it toward action or self-improvement. This grief deserves to be experienced completely, not fixed quickly, because rushing past it tends to leave the underlying pattern intact, simply repackaged with a slightly different justification. Once genuinely felt, rather than avoided, this grief naturally starts to redirect energy toward finally asking, in real time, going forward, what you actually want from the years remaining, rather than continuing to operate purely on inherited obligation. For the third sign, physical symptoms tied to specific relationships, the actual work requires taking your own body's data as seriously as you'd take a doctor's diagnosis, because in a real sense, it is one. This means actually tracking, honestly, which specific people or situations correlate with which specific symptoms, and treating that correlation as genuinely actionable information rather than dismissing it as coincidence. Reducing exposure to whatever your body has been trying to flag for years, sometimes decades, often produces physical improvement that no purely medical intervention alone was ever going to provide. For the fourth sign, intolerance for high-maintenance relationships, the actual work involves something that gets easier, not harder, with age. Simply reallocating your time and energy according to what you already know works, without needing every relationship to be salvaged or maintained out of habit or history. This might mean quietly reducing investment in relationships that have always required disproportionate management, while genuinely increasing investment in the relationships that have always felt comparatively easy and mutual. For the fifth sign, difficulty locating your own preferences, the actual work is almost embarrassingly simple in practice, even though it can feel awkward at first. Deliberately, repeatedly, practicing the question, what do I actually want in small, low-stakes situations until the muscle of locating a genuine answer starts to strengthen again. This doesn't require major life decisions to start. It can begin with something as small as choosing a restaurant, a show to watch, a way to spend a free afternoon, simply for the practice of locating and honoring a preference that's entirely your own. For the sixth sign, an increased baseline need for solitude. The actual work involves restructuring your calendar and your relationships around this need as a legitimate requirement, rather than an indulgence to apologize for. This might mean actually blocking out unstructured time the same way you'd block out any other important commitment, and communicating this need clearly to the people in your life, rather than continuing to treat your own restoration as something that only happens if there's leftover time after everyone else's needs have been met. For the seventh sign, the felt sense of finite time. The actual work is less about a specific action and more about letting this awareness genuinely inform every other decision on this list, rather than treating it as background anxiety to be managed and set aside. This sense of finitude, properly metabolized, becomes less about fear and more about clarity, a genuinely useful filter for deciding, quickly and confidently, which patterns are actually worth continuing and which have simply persisted out of inertia rather than genuine value. I want to say something important about why all 7 of these responses tend to move faster at this stage of life than they would have decades earlier. It's not because the underlying psychological work is easier. It's because the evidence supporting each of these responses is already so thoroughly accumulated that the usual doubt, the usual second-guessing, the usual need for more proof before acting has largely already been satisfied by decades of direct experience. An empath at this stage isn't guessing about which relationships and environments genuinely serve them. They know. The remaining work is almost entirely about permission and courage, rather than discovery. I want to leave you with something important about what this chapter can actually become, if these 7 signs are genuinely heeded, rather than continued to be pushed past out of old habit. This isn't a chapter of decline. It's frequently, when approached well, the most genuinely peaceful chapter an empath ever experiences, precisely because it's the first chapter built entirely on decades of hard-won self-knowledge, rather than on the trial and error, the obligation, and the uncertainty that characterized earlier decades. The depth of feeling, the perceptiveness, the capacity for genuine care that defined an empath's entire life doesn't diminish at this stage. It simply, finally, gets to be spent according to actual wisdom rather than reflexive habit. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through today. Picture an orchard planted many decades ago that spent its early years producing fruit indiscriminately, generously, giving to anyone who walked by, regardless of whether that fruit was actually appreciated or simply taken for granted. For years, this orchard gave everything it had, every season, without much thought to its own long-term sustainability, because there always seemed to be another season ahead, another chance to keep giving the same way it always had. Now picture that same orchard, decades later, its roots deeper than they've ever been, its understanding of its own soil, its own seasons, its own specific needs, more precise than at any earlier point in its existence. This orchard has learned, through decades of direct experience, exactly which conditions produce genuine, sustainable fruit, and which conditions simply exhaust it without giving anything meaningful back. It has learned exactly how much sun it actually needs, exactly how much water is enough versus excessive, exactly which seasons require rest rather than continued output. An orchard at this stage doesn't need to experiment anymore to discover what it needs. It already knows, with a precision that took decades to earn. The only remaining question is whether it will finally be tended according to that hard-won knowledge, or whether it will simply continue giving indiscriminately, out of old habit, into seasons that are, undeniably more limited than the many seasons that came before. An orchard tended wisely at this stage of its life doesn't produce less. It often produces its richest, most concentrated fruit yet. Not because it's trying harder, but because every bit of its remaining energy is finally being directed exactly where decades of experience have shown it actually belongs. That is what this chapter can become for an empath who finally, at this stage, starts tending themselves according to everything they've already quietly learned. Not less life, simply finally a wiser one,